Your flight attendants must now be seated for landing.
My name is Jacob Mchangama. I am the Executive Director of Justitia, a Copenhagen-based think tank. I'm trained as a lawyer, but I always had that interest in human rights. I came to see free speech as the most important human right of all. So you could say that it's almost become an obsession of mine.
We're really stoked to have Jacob Mchangama down here for this week.
Very nice to see you again, Jacob.
Good to see you, gentlemen. Thank you.
We didn't anticipate that the Minister of Justice would be re-announcing the hate speech laws the week that he arrived. So for a week where we've got a lot of media already lined up, it works pretty well.
I'm looking at this timetable and thinking this is exploitation.
You don't have time for anything.
He comes to New Zealand, he doesn't get any time outside of offices and people like us.
I've been traveling a lot, mostly to the US, but also book launch in the UK, and I've been in Norway and Czech Republic and so on. Absolutely delighted to have made it all the way to New Zealand due to the kind invitation of the FSU.
Dan, you want to get some general shots of Jacob on the waterfront, perhaps in front of Te Papa.
All right. I mean, you go to the gym, don't you? So maybe there could be a Rocky montage. We could do a montage ahead of the AGM appearance.
Well, definitely.
You rolling in a tyre and me with the stopwatch and
bare torso.
yeah, all of that.
Flexing.
That's going to be the cover of the documentary.
Flexing for free speech. My father is from the Comoro Islands in East Africa, and he was a political activist, first fighting against French colonialism, and then the authoritarian leader who took over after independence, and he had to leave, and that took him to Europe and eventually Denmark, where he met my mother. I'm not as much of an activist as he was, and not as much of an organizer as he was, but certainly an interest in current affairs and world politics is from him.
We had a meeting with the deputy leader of the National Party, Nicola Willis, who the National Party is the largest opposition party in Parliament at the moment. They've cancelled that, which is consistent with my op-ed today and stuff, just going, we really need the opposition to either get in behind these hate speech laws and make them the best in the world, or I would say do their jobs and actually hold the government to account. We'll be heading over to the Backbencher, quite a famous pub here, and we'll be meeting with Graeme Edgeler there, who is he's a lawyer and at Bankside Chambers and a legal commentator as well.
Graeme's engaged with us a bit online, sometimes positively and sometimes critically.
He was a student politician and he's regarded as an unbiased commentator.
He holds us our feet to the fire sometimes, and I'm really pleased with that. So, sometimes we need that, and he helps us do better.
the other thing though, he can really look at the history to date of the laws we have.
If you'll have seen, you'll know of a bunch of prosecutions in England for what people are calling hate speech. Our laws are basically the same. Theirs is probably slightly better than ours, and it's used completely differently. Statute, you'd think maybe even that our law was wider, that it covers more things. But exactly one person has been prosecuted ever. They were acquitted, and no one else has ever been prosecuted for it. And that's been the law since the 1970s.
I had the pleasure of meeting with Graeme Edgeler, and it was a sort of fascinating executive summary into laws around hate speech or the equivalent. So if I was to walk down the streets of Wellington with swastikas shouting anti-Semitic slogans, I would not be prosecuted.
You certainly wouldn't be prosecuted under the hate speech law.
It might be public order or something.
Yeah, there might be some sort of public order, which is sort of the problem that's general public order type things. But you would never be arrested, or at least you would never be convicted, I don't think, for calling a police officer's horse gay in New Zealand, which someone in the United Kingdom was convicted of, at least. Even if they change the law and make it, they're slightly widening it, cover sexuality, cover religion. Will prosecutors take a hint? We need to start prosecuting people for this. Yeah. And even though the law is actually very narrowly tailored to only cover the very worst of speech. That doesn't mean that's what's going to happen. A few years ago, we changed the Bail Act in a way which affected 50 people a year. You know, it's slightly harder for 50 to 60 people a year to get bail. And the number of people kept in prison as a result of that it went up by 1,000.
A cultural change
Yes.
among prosecutors, police,
Yes.
and potentially courts.
Yes, I think that is the concern. It's the cultural change. You know, it's, Parliament's done something, we have to react.
That was actually surprising to me. The police, prosecution, and courts in this country have been so hands-off. You go to a country like Germany or France, even Denmark, which has a pretty strong free speech traditions, you will easily find more than 100 cases of people being prosecuted for hate speech.
There's credibility for us to gain in admitting that these can be really big issues. And that's why I never hesitate to acknowledge that, you know, hate speech or myths or disinformation, these are questions we really do need to address. I don't think there's anything that's necessarily anti-free speech about that. But
So I had the privilege of actually meeting with civil servants from the Department of Internal Affairs. It was really interesting because they are grappling with what a lot of governments are grappling with. So what do we do about illegal content, harmful content in cyberspace, if you like? And a lot of democratic governments, especially in Europe, have taken a very, I would say, speech restrictive approach. We've seen the European Union adopting a Digital Services Act, and there's also initiatives to sort of crack down on misinformation and disinformation.
we don't need to agree necessarily on the extent of it or who was using it. We need to agree on what we're doing out of that. And so if they're saying it's such a problem that we're going to be really cracking down on differences of opinions on social media or whatever that may be, then that's when we get involved. But I think there's actually a chance for us to use free speech to counter mis and disinformation. I never wanted to be a bureaucrat, so walking with the government officials that are trying to orchestrate legislation or changes, we can actually support them in that role. We don't have to be the baddies every time.
I don't know what happens when politicians get involved, but it seemed like there was again, maybe a reflection of the culture of free speech in New Zealand, that the DIA seemed to see its mandate as something that should also safeguard free speech and not be sort of overzealous in trying to regulate the online sphere, which I thought was hopeful and charting a different direction than what you see in most democracies at the time.
After that, we'll give you a chance to sit down for a bit, and then we'll be taking you out to Kilburn, one of the largest mosques in the country. We approached one of their imams, and they said, "Oh, look, this is one of our more comms guys. Talk to him." So they were quite happy to talk to us, which we were really pleased with. What's interesting is there is an increase of Islam amongst the Māori population, and
Didn't know that.
and so for a portion of the tangata whenua, the indigenous population, the censorship regime that's been put forward is also in favour of protecting their minority voices as well. So it dovetails a little bit together into other issues.
Very good. You talk protecting their interests. It's not protecting their interests. It's actually prosecuting people who criticise their religion, which is something that free speech has always been essential for. I mean, I'm quite serious. I don't think you should use the jargon of the enemy.
When did I say protecting their interests?
You said so. They're also interested in law that protects their culture, protects their religion. Protects?
Allegedly.
No. The way the law works is that you're prosecuting using the power of the state, the police power of the state, to attack people who criticise their religion. And criticising someone's religion in politics has been right at the heart of achieving anything. I mean, where would we be if we hadn't been allowed to complain about kiddie fiddling priests?
And equally, like you were speaking about tangata whenua, how many Māori activists would have been, just chucked in
Silenced.
prison?
I just think we should check ourselves. We should not be using the language that they use to sanitise what is essentially an abuse of police power.
When we are talking about in New Zealand what happened on March 15th, so we are talking about people who were butchered, people who are still living the pain through bullets in their body. Nobody imagined this kind of thing would happen in a country like this. We have very strong New Zealand Bill of Rights, which guarantees freedom of expression. But when you have, for example, people saying some very vile things, it actually incites people. I don't think you can disagree with that.
Well, it depends on, how do you define incitement? If I said something offensive about a particular group, that might reflect poorly on me, but there's a difference between that and saying, oh, let's go murder this or that group. That the former is protected by free speech, but the latter is going too far.
We are in full agreement.
Okay.
We always say
let's wrap up.
When we were going through the whole exercise in New Zealand, we noted some of the vile statements even in Denmark at that time. And the guy, forgot his name, he was prosecuted. He was saying vile things like castrate Muslim men. He was saying things like, let's round up the Muslim families and sell them to the highest bidder. We have ample evidence that saying things incites people to violence. And that's where the legislation to be brought in.
It was difficult for me to exactly pin down his position. So on the one hand, he was adamant that it should only be about prohibiting incitement to violence, not broader categories. But then on the other hand, it seemed to me that his interpretation of what constituted incitement to violence was rather broader than incitement to violence.
Well, the Royal Commission said that faith and ableism wasn't included. Let's just include those two. So I don't see any problems. It's the political football that many people bring on, particularly people like, Free Speech Union and others who say, rah, 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 it's free speech issue. It's not a free speech issue.
You might remember Denmark was part of a controversy. A newspaper published cartoons of the Muslim prophet Muhammad, and many countries protested, and the Muslim community in Denmark, lots of them said this should be banned as either blasphemy and or hate speech. And lots of people on the right in Denmark said, no, free speech is absolute. You have the right to say whatever you want. Then there were a number of jihadist terrorist attacks in Denmark. And then a center-right government came into power, and they adopted a number of laws restricting the free speech of Muslims. And then suddenly you had people on the right who said, well, we need to limit free speech because this is dangerous. And so to me, that was a very good example of how if you're a minority and you argue for limitations on free speech, you're only ever a political majority away from being the target rather than the beneficiary.
What we're talking about is the New Zealand context. Let me give you one example. When Salman Rushdie's book came over here, our Muslim community, we didn't ask for it to be banned. We used that context to have debates at the universities. So New Zealand context is quite different from the European context. So what we are starting to see is people bring in viewpoints from overseas. Trumpism is another. We see the direct correlation of people like the Free Speech Union and others bringing in people from overseas without understanding the local context. You know how many legislation, how many prosecutions there has been under the human rights? One. And that was that's a civil approach, not a criminal approach.
But would you then? But then, if you're amending the legislation, then the danger would be that
we're not amending. We're not amending. We're including just the word faith with the others. So I don't see any problem. People are making it into a free speech issue. It is not a free speech issue.
But would you be in favor of more cases being brought?
Look, I would be only favor of if there's for us, the Muslim community and other faith-based communities to feel safer. Police figures, 70% of the faith-based is against Muslims. And we are not covered as a faith. We are covered as an ethnic group, but we are not an ethnic group. But that's all we're wanting. So I'm not sure you were aware of this. So, but what political parties, some people wanted to turn into the free speech issue. Let's be very clear. We have free speech already in this country. We already have the New Zealand Bill of Rights, which actually says freedom of expression is there.
Yeah, but so
we are not limiting it. It's there in the Royal Commission what the proposition is. The faith-based are not covered. So let's just bring these two people. That's it. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
It's, I know I'll have a good time reading this. I'd like you to have a copy of our Quran.
Shukran.
And the Royal Commission report.
Very good.
In there, it has the issue of the free speech.
The Dark Ages were not as dark as historians once believed. The medieval period, there were a lot of important developments there, both in the Islamic world and later on with the establishment of universities here in Europe.
We were supposed to be on the breakfast show this morning, which would have been a great opportunity to discuss these issues, with the Minister of Justice pushing the hate speech laws through, but unfortunately they pulled the plug last minute. They go all right?
Yeah, I think that hit the spot.
Brilliant. Bit of a situation online though. Paul Hunt, the Human Rights Commissioner, talking about mis and disinformation, but then he turns off the comments on his Facebook, and of course that's a red flag to a bull, isn't it? So people going crazy over it at the moment.
Well, set up a meeting, I'll debate it.
Well, we've reached out a lot of times. We also just recently posted a list of a dozen politicians, academics, journalists, researchers, and we kind of reached out to them as a group and said, come along to the meeting, have a chat with Jacob, put your cards on the table, we'll put ours down and see where it lands. And not one of them was willing to talk to you, so
Okay.
disappointing stuff.
Racism.
David, you've got some thoughts, or do you want me to throw a question at you to get you going?
Oh, I've got some thoughts, Roderick.
Off you go then.
I've been listening to this argument, and Moana Maniapoto put it in a rather shallow and one-sided Brian Bruce documentary on Prime on Thursday evening, that free speech advocates have nothing to fear because we all seem to be from the majority social group, and we are not at the risk of harm that minority social groups experience from the abuse of free speech. I think it's a profound misunderstanding of how majorities and minorities work in a democratic society. Majorities and minorities, when we're talking about freedom of opinion and expression, aren't fixed social groups. They are shifting constellations of ideas and beliefs and opinions and attitudes and values. Now, I'm a gay man, but I happen to think that most gender theory is nonsense. So I think it's a huge mistake to reify majority and minority opinions into majority and minority social groups. Because let's never forget that social groups, whether actual or imagined, also include minority opinions.
Once you're in Christchurch, you'll be meeting with Dr. David Bromell. He wrote a book called Hate Speech and Regulations, The Limits of Censorship. So is an expert on the Christchurch call, and I think teases out a lot of the reasons we've ended up with the content regulation review, the hate speech proposals, that kind of thing. Doesn't unpack the free speech argument so much, but kind of says, what are the implications of this going to be?
I had about 20 years of being the unfortunate centre of debate in the churches here about gay people in ministry. And during that time, I endured a fair amount of what probably today we would call hate speech, but I never thought of it that way at the time. And I left the church in 2003, and social media didn't start till 2004, 2006, yeah. And so I was spared the amplification of hate speech through social media. But when I look back on that time, the people who spoke, sometimes in unpleasant ways, opposing my ministry, were doing so out of their own understandings of scripture and tradition.
Yeah.
And the last thing I would have wanted would be for the state to criminalise them for expressing what they thought and felt, or fine them or put them in prison. I just find it extraordinary that minority groups would want to give the state that much power.
Yeah.
Because it will come back to bite us.
There's an attitude of boxing races into how they should think and feel, and actually governments making a decision that if you belong to this race, that you should think and feel this way. And I find that quite a scary thought, really, that there's a whole lot of Māori out there that have basically been shown the true colours of what this hate speech law might look like, in the way you're even being told how to think and feel.
I've been called an Uncle Tom, and I'm seen as, I guess, betraying the community by saying that actually Christians should be able to tell me that I'm going to hell, and I can say, like, good on you, I don't think it exists, you know. But on the whole, I would say that most of the LGBT people in powerful positions really back censorship.
Which is, I think, a really interesting development, because it shows you something about the power dynamics of hate speech law. So if you were to go back 50 years or 40 years,
10 years ago, when homosexual marriage was
because you were not, it was still seen as a taboo. You wouldn't have that acceptance. You would never be lobbying for free speech restrictions, right? You would be relying on it to make your case, and that's how you appeal to a majority to become accepted, is by using free speech.
These are exercises of power. There is no assistance from a hate speech law. It doesn't help anyone. All it does is give you a lever to exercise power against the people you don't like. And secular societies have abandoned religion, or think they have, but they haven't lost their religious impulse. And the core part of the religious impulse is to define sin and sinners and punish them. And constantly to refine the definition so that you've constantly got a new brand of people who are sinners you can punish, and that you can call the mob to howl against them and burn them. And we have our
establishment does that.
The pylon is the modern equivalent of the burning at the stake. It doesn't hurt as much at the moment, but that's something they're sorry about. They'd really like to be, if you look at the language, they'd like to burn at the stake.
And so we talk about social media, but a lot of the content might be seen as antisocial, but to try and stop it by legislation is actually to give support to people like Tarrant who wish to have hate speech legislation enacted as a response to what they did. If you try to limit free speech, you get the confirmation of what we call the radical loser, who believes that society is constructed against them, that there is this conspiracy of forces which are seeking to limit their participation and their narrative of what is actually happening. What we need is a proactive response, which is about education. It's not about limitation, it's about educating a community, not prescribing and limiting actions as if the limitation is going to achieve the type of society we wish, because the limitation just increases the sense of anger that they're actually trying to stop.
The arguments that you're likely to make things worse, not better, is something that resonates with my own research and findings, which suggest, in fact, that countries that crack down on right-wing extremist opinion are also more likely to suffer right-wing extremist violence. Even if free speech can sometimes lead to and inspire violent acts, I think in general, overall, it has a de-radicalizing effect. The fact that you're actually allowed to air your grievances might make you less likely to take up arms and use violence.
I see speech issues as being a core part of what the left at least used to be about, and progressing the rights of the subjugated, the oppressed. And reading this book, it's a fascinating insight into how it fluxes and changes over the millennia. So why have we got to the situation now where, at least on the surface, do you think, at least on the surface, the left seems to be a bit more hostile to the expansion of speech rights?
John Milton, the famous English poet, wrote the Areopagitica in 1644. And it's a very eloquent work, but when you read it carefully, you find out that John Milton is in favor of press freedom, but certainly not for Catholics. certainly not for radical Protestants, and certainly not for anyone sort of subversive of government and religion. It's basically press freedom for mainline Protestant sects who should be able to discuss their differences. And we have this ability of human beings, our biases, allow us to construct these elaborate arguments for why restricting a particular type of speech that we don't like is not really a restriction of free speech. It's actually a protection of the values and systems that are necessary for free speech to flourish.
Yeah, that's fine. So if I will introduce you, what's your title?
Chief Executive of the Free Speech Union. Do you want to draw attention to his book from the start, maybe?
Why don't you do it?
Okay, and I can.
Then you've got.
Wonderful.
When democracies no longer play a strong countervailing force towards the inevitable tendency of authoritarian states to want to limit free speech, then free speech at the global level really tends to suffer. And we actually see a very unhealthy cross-fertilization of various censorship regimes across regime types. So let me give you an example. Germany in 2017 adopted a law which said that large social media platforms had to remove illegal content within 24 hours or risk fines of up to 50 million euros. So my institution did a report where we found that countries including Russia, Belarus, Turkey, Venezuela, copy-pasted this German precedent. Of course, they did it in bad faith. They used it to outlaw swaths of speech that we were protected in Germany, but they did it with explicit reference to this German model. And what does that do? It makes it very difficult for democracies to criticize this development because you can't do it on a principled ground.
Is that a circumstance where it's perhaps appropriate to limit free speech when what is, provably false information is being propagated and it may put the lives of vulnerable individuals on the line?
If you look at the recommendations by various health organizations, at a certain point they said, face masks are not likely to protect you, and then they changed their minds. And that's not because Bill Gates propagated a global conspiracy. It's just because, you find out in science leads you in different directions. So if you sort of say, okay, we're a month into the pandemic, this is the truth, and we'll legislate that, well, then you'll be standing with egg on your face when you have to change that as your understanding grows better. And you're likely to erode trust, because if you come out saying, this is the truth about the pandemic, and then change that, then people are going to say, hold on, you're trying to be a ministry of truth, and what you said yesterday is no longer applies.
So we've just heard that David Farrier will also be talking with Kim today, and so he'll be discussing kind of the opposite perspective around hate speech laws. And he's just been part of a documentary called Web of Chaos, which is discussing misinformation, disinformation. Kate Hanna, again, the leader, the director of the Disinformation Project, is a key personality in that as well. And it's all part of this fixation on speech has been the cause of so much of the hate and polarization and division which is emerging.
We live in a time where there's sort of widespread elite panic about the unmediated digital sphere that has sort of upended traditional authority. Traditional media no longer plays the role as gatekeepers to the same extent that they did before. Politicians no longer have a solid grasp on the public sphere as they did before. They're being challenged. New voices are being allowed in that weren't there before. And that is likely to cause alarm to traditional elites and gatekeepers.
She'll come at you fairly aggressively, so I would just have a fairly resilient, mildly aggressive stance from the beginning, because I think that's the posture she'll be coming at it with.
All right.
20 minutes, eh?
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah, awesome. So yeah.
Can I join you in there?
Yeah, for sure.
Awesome.
Yeah. Cool. Sweet man, he's just hopped in. I'll switch his mic on so you guys can have a chat.
Black Ferns insist they're excited, not nervous, ahead of tonight's Rugby World Cup semi-final against France at Eden Park. Coach Wayne Smith
Jacob, can you hear me? It's Mark from Wellington.
Yes, I can indeed, Mark.
Oh, wonderful. Now, I really want to know, is it Jacob or Jacob in terms of what you would prefer?
Jacob is fine.
Fantastic.
Jacob Mchangama is the founder and director of Justitia, a think tank focusing on human rights and free speech. Here's another way of elite panic evidencing itself. It's an email from a listener. He says, could you ask Jacob why he thinks the current calls for free speech tend to come from groups made up of traditionally privileged parts of society, seeking freedom to punch down. Free speech types, including the Free Speech Union, which brought you out here, are more likely to be male, white, cisgender, straight, economically privileged. The areas of discourse in which calls for free speech are often made involve traditionally marginalised groups, the rainbow community, Indigenous people. The tiny rebalancing of power entails a small relative shift that the free speechers, still the most powerful and platformed, are mobilising their privilege to resist. Sorry about that long email.
Yeah.
But it makes a point, right?
Yeah, I think it's a deeply misguided one that rests on very shallow empirical ground. It's this idea that free speech entrenches unequal power relations and that the values of free speech and equality are mutually exclusive, whereas the history of free speech, I think, clearly shows that they are values that are mutually reinforcing. Shining a light on the injustice of being singled out for discrimination, being able to protest publicly, petitioning politicians for change. This country, I believe, was the first to provide women with the right to vote, and I believe petitions were very important in mobilizing public opinion. The same goes with racial minorities. I would actually argue that the position that the listener, with all due respect, articulates is in itself a very privileged position, because it takes a uniquely Western perspective. But look around the world and you will still see that those who are persecuted and marginalized and minorities are the ones whose right to free speech are being systematically abused. So free speech still serves very much as, I would argue, one of the most powerful engines of human equality and dignity that human beings have ever stumbled upon.
I mean, you've become something of a darling to right-wing groups and institutions. Why?
I don't know if I've been if I'm a darling to right-wing.
I don't think many people would be invited to address the Ayn Rand Institute.
Well, I've addressed, been on discussions with ACLU and others. Been to the University of Auckland. I don't know yesterday.
That's fine.
Yeah.
But the fact is that all the communication that I'm getting, and all the people who are opposing vocally hate speech laws in New Zealand are from the right of the spectrum.
Well,
no shame in that. It's just a strange historical fact of interest. I wondered.
I have here with me a person in the studio called Dane Giraud, who's a member of the FSU, and he's shaking his head. He's a left-wing working-class Jew. So I think that disproves your point. I'm not
Good man to have on your side.
I think, if there's hypocrisy by people on the right when it comes to free speech, then call that out. But don't surrender an emancipatory cause like free speech that has been absolutely instrumental in providing a voice to the voiceless, giving rights to the poor and propertyless, to marginalized minorities, and so on. We can have vehement disagreements about levels of taxation, politics, philosophy, religion, but we can come together in agreement that the right to free speech is really the antithesis of violence. It's what allows us to have a free and open democracy where we can be neighbors, spouses, colleagues, and friends. And we need that radical free speech in order to be able to compromise and be pragmatic and find solutions. So why would anyone on the left or the right, for that matter, surrender that cause to someone else based on sort of narrow tribal political affiliation? That is bewildering to me. When the government announced plans to present a hate speech bill, I understand there was a lot of pushback from civil society. That's a very healthy sign that a lot of people, ordinary people, have internalized the value of free speech, and it's probably not because they're in favor of subjecting various groups to hatred and they want impunity for that, but it's just a realization that free speech is a very precious freedom. And if I was in the government, I would maybe say, be proud that you have a robust culture of free speech that has contributed to the thriving of Kiwi democracy.
Jacob Mchangama, are you still there?
I am.
I have heard a million ways to pronounce your name. Tell me how you pronounce it.
Mchangama.
Jacob, Jacob, or Jacob?
Pretty agnostic about that.
Okay. Free Speech is the title of his book, History from Socrates to Social Media. It's 18 minutes to 10. David Farrier has gone down a bigger rabbit